The weight of the logs grew heavier with each step as Willa Matthews struggled through the snow-laden forest. February 1878 had brought another bitter winter to the Montana Territory, and her gloved fingers ached from the cold despite the exertion. Her breath formed clouds in the frigid air as she paused, shifting the bundle of firewood in her arms. 3 months since her father's passing, and still the simplest chores felt like mountains to climb. A twig snapped behind her. Willa spun around, nearly dropping her precious cargo. A tall figure emerged from between the pines, his features shadowed beneath a worn Stetson. His horse, a magnificent chestnut stallion, stood patiently behind him. The stranger's shoulders were broad beneath his sheepskin coat, his stance confident yet cautious. "Madam," he said, touching the brim of his hat. His voice was deep but gentle, like distant thunder without the threat of storm. "That's quite a load you're carrying." Willa clutched the firewood tighter. Strangers meant danger, especially for a woman alone. "I manage fine, sir." He took a step closer, and she noticed his eyes blue as a summer sky against sun-bronzed skin. "You don't have to anymore." The wind whistled through the trees, scattering snow from the branches above. Something in his gaze held no threat, only a genuine offer of assistance. "I don't know you," Willa said, her voice stronger than she felt. "Isaac Thornton," he replied, not moving any closer. "Just passing through, saw you struggling with that wood and thought I might lend a hand." He gestured to the bundle in her arms. No strings attached. Just one neighbor helping another. Willa hesitated. 3 months of solitude had taught her self-reliance, but also the harsh reality of frontier life. Pride wouldn't keep her cabin warm tonight. "Willa Matthews," she finally said, "my homestead is just beyond that ridge." Isaac nodded, a small smile warming his features. "May I?" He reached for the firewood, and after a moment's pause, she allowed him to take it. "Much obliged, Mr. Thornton," she said, straightening her back and feeling the relief in her muscles. "Isaac, please." He balanced the wood effortlessly in one arm and took his horse's reins with the other. "Lead the way, Miss Matthews." As they walked together through the snow-covered forest, neither could have known how this simple act of kindness would change both their lives forever. Willa's cabin came into view as they crested the ridge. Small but sturdy, smoke curled from the chimney where her morning fire was dying down. A barn stood nearby, housing her 2 milk cows and the mule that had been her father's pride. "You live here alone?" Isaac asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Since my father passed in November," she answered. The words still tasted bitter on her tongue. "Pneumonia took him quickly." Isaac nodded solemnly. "I'm sorry for your loss." They reached the cabin door and Willa pushed it open. The interior was neat but sparse, a table with 2 chairs, a small cooking area, and a bed tucked behind a homespun curtain. Books lined a small shelf, evidence of small comforts preserved in a harsh land. "You can set those by the hearth," she directed, removing her woolen scarf. Isaac placed the firewood carefully beside the dying embers. "You're quite away from town." 5 miles to Pinecrest, she confirmed, "not so far in good weather." He studied her for a moment, then glanced around the cabin. "And how do you manage? The land, I mean." Willa's chin lifted slightly. "The same as anyone. Work hard, sleep little." She moved to the stove, where a pot of coffee still held some warmth. "Would you like some coffee? It's the least I can offer for your help." Isaac removed his hat, revealing dark hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck. "That would be mighty kind, thank you." As Willa poured the coffee into 2 chipped mugs, she assessed her unexpected visitor. He wasn't like the rough miners or desperate homesteaders that occasionally passed through. There was a quiet confidence in his movements, a gentleness that belied his rugged appearance. "What brings you to these parts, Mr. Thornton?" she asked, handing him the steaming mug. "Isaac," he reminded her with a small smile. "I'm heading north to visit my brother's ranch near Fort Benton. Thought I'd take the scenic route through the mountains." "In February?" Willa couldn't hide her skepticism. He chuckled, the sound warming the room more than the fire. "Perhaps not my wisest decision. Got caught in that snowstorm 3 days back and had to hole up in a cave until it passed." "You're lucky you didn't freeze to death," she observed, sipping her coffee. "Wouldn't be the first time I've beaten the odds." Something flashed in his eyes, a memory, perhaps, before he continued. I rode with the cavalry for 7 years after the war, learned a thing or two about survival. Willa studied him with new interest. The cavalry, is that where you learn to sneak up on unsuspecting women in the forest? His laugh was unexpected and genuine. Actually, madam, that was pure accident. I was trying to avoid spooking you. Well, you failed spectacularly, she said, finding herself smiling despite her best intentions. They fell into conversation easily as they finished their coffee. Isaac spoke of his time in the cavalry, patrolling the frontier and negotiating with tribal leaders. Willa shared stories of growing up as the daughter of a widowed rancher who'd never quite struck it rich, but had taught her everything about surviving on the frontier. He sounds like he was a good man, Isaac said when she finished telling him about her father's dedication to education, how he'd insisted she learn to read and write even when neighbors thought it wasteful for a girl. The best, she agreed, a lump forming in her throat. But now I'm wondering if I can keep his dream alive. This place, she gestured around them, it's too much for one person. Isaac set down his empty mug. Have you considered selling, and go where? The question came out sharper than she intended. This is my home. My mother is buried on that hill beyond the creek. My father beside her now. I won't abandon them or what they built. I didn't mean to offend, Isaac said gently. It's just that frontier life is hard enough with a family, alone. He let the word hang between them. Willa stood and collected their mugs. I'm not afraid of hard work, Mr. Thornton. I can see that, he replied, rising as well. He towered over her 5'4" frame, but something in his posture made her feel like an equal rather than diminished. And it's still Isaac. A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the crackling fire and the distant howl of a wolf. I should be on my way, Isaac finally said, reaching for his hat. Daylight's precious this time of year, Willa nodded, suddenly reluctant to see him go. It had been months since she'd had a proper conversation with anyone. Thank you again for your help with the firewood. It was my pleasure. He settled his hat on his head, adjusting the brim. Miss Matthews, I don't mean to overstep, but before I continue my journey, might I chop some more wood for you? That stack won't last long in this weather. The offer surprised her. Most travelers would be eager to make up lost time, not delay their journey further. I couldn't ask that of you. You didn't ask, I offered. His eyes crinkled at the corners. Besides, I could use the exercise after 3 days in that cave. Willa hesitated only briefly. There's an axe in the barn, and I'd be happy to prepare some lunch while you work. Isaac's smile broadened. Now that sounds like a fair trade. As she watched him stride toward the barn, Willa felt something she hadn't experienced in months' hope. Not that this stranger would solve all her problems, but that perhaps the world wasn't as cold and unforgiving as the Montana winter had led her to believe. The rhythmic sound of the axe splitting wood filled the air as Willa busied herself preparing a simple meal of salt pork, beans, and the last of her cornbread. Through the window, she watched Isaac work, his movements efficient and powerful. He'd removed his coat despite the cold, and his breath formed clouds in the frigid air with each swing of the axe. By the time she called him in for lunch, a substantial pile of split logs stood neatly stacked against the side of the cabin. You've done enough for 3 weeks' worth of fires, she said as he washed his hands in the basin by the door. Winter's not done with us yet, he replied, drying his hands on the offered towel. Better to have too much than too little. They ate at her small table, the simple meal tasting better than it had any right to. Isaac told her more about his brother's ranch, how William Thornton had started with nothing 10 years ago and now ran 500 head of cattle. And what about you? Willa asked. No ranch of your own. A shadow crossed his face. Not yet. After the cavalry, I worked various jobs, cattle drives, hunting buffalo for the railroad, even tried my hand at mining for a spell. He shrugged, never found a place that felt like home. And your parents, gone, he said simply. Pa during the war, Ma 2 years after. It's just Will and me now. Willa nodded, understanding the weight of that statement. At least you have your brother. Yes, Isaac agreed, his expression softening. Though we're as different as two men can be, he's all business and planning while I He smiled ruefully. Well, let's just say I follow the wind more than a compass. Is that why you're taking the scenic route through a mountain pass in February? She teased. Isaac laughed. Caught me there, Miss Matthews. Willa, she corrected him. If I'm to call you Isaac, then you should use my given name. Willa, he repeated, and something about the way he said it made her heart beat a little faster. It suits you. Their conversation continued through the afternoon as Isaac insisted on completing more chores around her homestead. He mended a loose board on the barn door, checked her cattle for any signs of illness, and even climbed onto her roof to clear away snow that had built up dangerously near the chimney. As twilight approached, Willa realized he couldn't possibly reach the next town before nightfall. You're welcome to sleep in the barn, she offered as they stood outside, watching the sun sink behind the mountains. It's warm enough with the animals, and I have extra blankets. Isaac looked at the darkening sky. I wouldn't want to impose. It's no imposition after all you've done today, she insisted. And only a fool would set out in these mountains at night, he grinned. Are you calling me a fool, Willa Matthews? Only if you refuse my offer, she replied, matching his smile. Then I gratefully accept. He turned toward his horse, which had been contentedly munching hay in her corral. Samson will appreciate it too. They prepared the barn together, creating a comfortable sleeping area in the clean hay of an empty stall. Willa provided blankets and even an old lantern that had been her father's. I'll have breakfast ready at sunrise, she said as they finished. Nothing fancy, but hot at least. Sounds perfect, Isaac replied. Their eyes met in the golden glow of the lantern, and for a moment neither spoke. Something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits. Willa was the first to look away. Well, good night then. Good night, Willa, Isaac said softly, and thank you. As she walked back to her cabin in the gathering darkness, Willa couldn't remember the last time she'd felt so at ease with another person. Isaac Thornton was a stranger, would be gone tomorrow, yet something about his presence had breathed life back into her homestead. For the first time since her father's death, the silence didn't feel so overwhelming. That night, as the wind howled outside her cabin, Willa slept more soundly than she had in months. Morning arrived with another heavy snowfall. Willa awoke to a world blanketed in white, the familiar landscape transformed into something ethereal. She stoked the fire and began preparing breakfast, wondering if Isaac was already awake in the barn. Her answer came with a knock at the door. When she opened it, Isaac stood there with an armful of firewood, snow dusting his shoulders and hat. Good morning, he said cheerfully. Thought you might need this for the stove. Thank you, she replied, stepping back to let him in. Sleep well. Like a rock, he confirmed, placing the wood beside the hearth. Your barn is more comfortable than some hotels I've stayed in. Willa laughed, turning back to the stove where bacon sizzled in a cast iron pan. Breakfast is almost ready. I hope you're hungry. Starving, he admitted, removing his hat and coat. Something smells wonderful. They ate together at her small table, bacon, biscuits, and strong coffee. Through the window, they could see the snow continuing to fall, heavy flakes swirling in the wind. Looks like a proper blizzard brewing, Isaac observed, finishing his second biscuit. Willa nodded, concern creasing her brow. The pass to Fort Benton will be impassable if this continues. Isaac studied the weather for a long moment before turning back to her. I should probably wait it out. Trying to navigate those trails in this would be foolish, he hesitated. That is, if you don't mind me imposing a bit longer. Relief flooded through her, though she tried not to show it. The thought of being alone again so soon had been unexpectedly disappointing. It's no imposition. In fact, I could use the help with a few more chores if you're willing. More than willing, he said with a smile. It's the least I can do for your hospitality. They spent the day working together, falling into an easy rhythm. Isaac helped her muck out the barn stalls while she tended to the milk cows. Together they checked her modest root cellar, organizing the remaining preserves and potatoes that would need to last until spring. As they worked, they talked. Isaac told her about his adventures across the frontier hunting expeditions in Colorado, cattle drives through Texas, even a brief stint as a deputy marshal in a Kansas town. "You've lived quite a life," Willa remarked as they took a break by the fire, warming their hands after clearing snow from the path between the cabin and barn. "Restless is what my brother calls it," Isaac admitted. "Says I need to put down roots before I'm too old to enjoy them." "And what do you think?" she asked, curious about this wandering cowboy who had appeared in her forest. Isaac stared into the flames. "I think a man needs to find the right place to plant those roots, otherwise they'll never take hold." The blizzard continued through the day and into the night. After dinner, a hearty stew Willa prepared from her precious stores, Isaac insisted on returning to the barn despite her concerns about the worsening weather. "I've weathered worse," he assured her. "Besides, it wouldn't be proper for me to stay in the cabin." Willa knew he was right, but the thought of him trudging through the snowdrifts to the cold barn troubled her. "Take an extra blanket at least," she insisted, pressing a thick quilt into his hands. "It was my father's, the warmest we have." Their fingers brushed during the exchange, sending an unexpected warmth through her that had nothing to do with the fire. "Thank you, Willa," he said softly, "for everything." "Be careful out there," she replied, unable to meet his gaze for fear he might read too much in her eyes. After he left, Willa sat by the fire, listening to the wind howl around her cabin. She thought about Isaac out in the barn, this stranger who no longer felt like a stranger. In just 2 days, he had filled a void she hadn't fully acknowledged existed. The blizzard lasted 3 more days, keeping Isaac at her homestead longer than either had anticipated. Each day they worked together, tackling chores that Willa had been postponing for months. Isaac repaired fences, reinforced the barn roof, and even fashioned a new handle for her broken hoe. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire after dinner, talking until the flames died down. Willa found herself sharing stories she hadn't told anyone about her mother's death when she was 12, her dreams of someday becoming a teacher, her fears about surviving alone on the homestead. Isaac listened with genuine interest, never dismissing her concerns or aspirations the way so many men might have. Instead, he encouraged her, speaking of a schoolhouse being built near his brother's ranch and how the growing community would soon need an educated woman to teach the children. On the 4th morning, Willa awoke to silence. The howling wind had ceased, and when she looked outside, the world sparkled under a brilliant blue sky. The storm had passed. Isaac seemed to realize it too when he came for breakfast, his expression a mixture of relief and something that looked almost like regret. "Seems the weather's cleared," he said, accepting the cup of coffee she offered. "Yes," Willa agreed, trying to ignore the hollow feeling in her chest. "You'll be able to continue your journey," he nodded slowly. "I should reach my brother's ranch in 3 days if the trails aren't too badly drifted." They ate in silence, the reality of their imminent separation hanging between them. Finally, Isaac set down his fork. "Willa," he began, his voice unusually hesitant. "These past few days," she looked up, meeting his gaze. "Yes, they've been." He searched for words, unexpected, in the best possible way. Willa felt her cheeks warm. "For me as well." Isaac leaned forward slightly. "I'm not good with fancy words, but I want you to know that a sharp knock at the door interrupted him. Willa jumped, startled by the sound. Visitors were rare, especially after a storm. She rose and opened the door to find Sheriff James Porter on her threshold, his horse stamping impatiently behind him. "Miss Matthews," he said, tipping his hat. "Glad to see you weathered the storm all right. Been checking on the outlying homesteads." His eyes narrowed as he spotted Isaac at the table. "Didn't realize you had company." "Sheriff," Willa acknowledged, stepping back to allow him entry. "This is Isaac Thornton." He was passing through when the blizzard hit and has been kind enough to help around the homestead while waiting out the storm. The sheriff nodded tersely at Isaac, who had risen from his seat. "Thornton." "Sheriff," Isaac replied, his posture relaxed but alert. Porter turned back to Willa. "Just wanted to make sure you were all right, Miss Matthews. Town's concerned about you out here alone since your pa passed." "I appreciate the concern," Willa said politely, "but as you can see, I'm managing fine." The sheriff's gaze traveled between her and Isaac, his expression unreadable. "Well, I should continue my rounds, more folks to check on." He turned to leave, then paused. Oh, nearly forgot. There's word of bandits operating in the territory. Stagecoach was robbed near Helena last week. Keep your doors locked. Thank you for the warning, Willa replied. After the sheriff departed, an awkward silence filled the cabin. Whatever Isaac had been about to say remained unspoken. I should probably start packing up, he finally said. Want to make some progress before nightfall? Willa nodded, unable to voice the protest rising in her throat. What right did she have to ask him to stay? He had his own life, his own journey. They spent the morning preparing for his departure. Willa packed him food for the trail: jerky, biscuits, and some dried apples from her stores. Isaac readied Samson, checking the horse's shoes and saddle. By noon, he was ready to leave. They stood outside the cabin, the brilliant sun making the snow-covered landscape almost blindingly beautiful. I can't thank you enough for your hospitality, Isaac said, holding Samson's reins, and for sharing your fire and food during the storm. You more than earned your keep, Willa replied, trying to keep her voice steady. The repairs you made will see me through until spring. Isaac nodded, looking toward the distant mountains he would need to cross. Then he turned back to her, his blue eyes intense. Willa, I'm not good at goodbyes. He shifted his weight, uncharacteristically uncertain. But I want you to know that these days here, they've meant something to me, her heart quickened. They've meant something to me too, Isaac. He took a step closer. I'd like to write to you if that would be all right. And perhaps when I've settled some business with my brother, I could stop by on my return journey. Hope blossomed in her chest. I'd like that very much. For a moment, it seemed he might say more, might even close the distance between them, but instead he simply nodded and mounted Samson. Until we meet again, Willa Matthews, he said, tipping his hat. Safe travels, Isaac Thornton, she replied, watching as he guided his horse down the snowy path toward the main trail. She stood there long after he disappeared from sight, the cold gradually seeping through her coat. Only when she could no longer feel her fingers did she finally turn back to her cabin, suddenly emptier than it had been before Isaac's arrival. The days that followed were harder than Willa had anticipated. She threw herself into her chores, tending to the animals and maintaining the homestead as her father had taught her. But in the quiet evenings, she found herself listening for a knock that didn't come, looking toward the chair where Isaac had sat by her fire. 2 weeks passed with no word. Willa told herself not to be foolish. Mail was unreliable in the best conditions, and winter in the Montana territory made deliveries even more uncertain. Still, each day without a letter dampened her spirits a little more. In late February, she made the difficult journey into Pinecrest for supplies. The town was little more than a main street with a general store, saloon, small church, and the sheriff's office, but it was her lifeline to the outside world. As she loaded her purchases into her wagon, Martha Wilson, the storekeeper's wife, approached with a knowing smile. There's a letter for you, Miss Matthews, she said, producing an envelope from her apron pocket. Came in with yesterday's mail. Willa's heart leaped at the sight of her name written in a strong, masculine hand. Thank you, Mrs. Wilson. Must be someone special, the older woman observed with twinkling eyes. Not many young ladies out here get personal correspondence from Fort Benton. Willa tucked the letter safely into her coat, unwilling to share this precious connection with the town's most notorious gossip. Just a friend passing through, she said casually. Promised to write when he reached his destination. Mrs. Wilson looked unconvinced but didn't press further. Well, you take care on the ride home. Looks like more snow coming. Willa could barely focus on the 5-mile journey back to her homestead, the letter burning a hole in her pocket. Only when she was safely inside her cabin, with a fresh fire warming the room, did she finally allow herself to break the seal. Isaac's words flowed across the pages, describing his journey through the mountains, his arrival at his brother's ranch, and the warm welcome he'd received. He wrote of the land, 5,000 acres of prime grazing country with a river running through it, and of his brother's growing family. But it was the final paragraph that made her breath catch. I find myself thinking of your cabin in the woods more often than I care to admit. The quiet companionship we shared during those snowbound days has stayed with me. I've spoken to Will about my plans, and once the spring cattle drive is complete in May, I intend to make good on my promise to visit you again if you'll have me. There are matters I wish to discuss that seem too important for paper and ink. Until then, please know that you are in my thoughts daily. With warmest regards, Isaac. Willa read the letter 3 times before carefully folding it and placing it in her mother's old wooden box where she kept her most treasured possessions. May seemed an eternity away, but now she had something to look forward to beyond mere survival. In the weeks that followed, they exchanged more letters. Isaac told her about life on the ranch, about helping his brother prepare for calving season and the plans for expansion. Willa wrote of her daily struggles and small triumphs, the early vegetables sprouting in her garden as the snow receded, the new calf born to one of her milk cows, the roof that leaked during the spring thaw. Through their correspondence, the connection that had begun during those blizzard days deepened. Willa found herself sharing thoughts and dreams she'd scarcely acknowledged even to herself. Isaac's replies were equally candid, revealing a man who had spent years searching for purpose and belonging. As April turned to May, Willa began preparing for Isaac's visit with an anticipation that both thrilled and frightened her. She cleaned the cabin from top to bottom, mended curtains that had hung untouched since her mother's day, and even used precious funds to purchase fabric for a new dress when she made her monthly trip to Pinecrest. She was returning from that very trip, her wagon loaded with supplies and the blue calico fabric carefully wrapped in paper, when she noticed smoke rising from the direction of her homestead. At first, she thought it might be a controlled burn from a neighboring property, but as she rounded the bend in the trail, horror froze her blood. Her barn was engulfed in flames. Willa snapped the reins, urging her mule to a speed the poor beast had likely never attempted. As she drew closer, she could hear the terrified bellowing of her cattle. 2 figures darted around the burning structure, men she didn't recognize, leading her milk cows toward a waiting wagon, rustlers. Taking advantage of the chaos they'd created to steal her livestock. Without thinking, Willa reached for the rifle her father had insisted she learn to use. She pulled her wagon to a halt a safe distance away and took aim at the ground near the thieves. "Step away from my cattle," she shouted, firing a warning shot that kicked up dirt at their feet. The men whirled around, clearly surprised to find themselves confronted by a woman with a rifle. One was tall and lanky with a pockmarked face, the other shorter but powerfully built. "Well, look what we have here, Jed," the shorter man called to his companion. "The little lady's come home early." "Drop your gun, girlie," the one called Jed replied, drawing his own pistol. "Ain't worth dying over a couple of cows." Willa's hands trembled, but she kept the rifle aimed in their direction. "This is my property, I won't let you take it." The shorter man laughed, a harsh sound that sent chills down her spine. "Your property, ain't you heard? Women can't own property without a husband. We're just claiming what's going unused." "The law says differently," Willa retorted, though fear was building in her chest. These men were dangerous, and she was alone. Jed started moving toward her wagon, his pistol trained on her. "Put down the rifle, or I'll put a hole in that pretty head of yours." Willa's mind raced. If she surrendered, there was no telling what these men would do to her. If she fired, she might hit one of them, but the other would surely kill her. Either way, her chances seemed grim. The sound of approaching hoofbeats distracted all 3 of them. A rider was coming fast down the trail from the north, the opposite direction from town. "Willa." A familiar voice called out, "Get down, Isaac." It was Isaac. Without hesitation, Willa ducked below the side of her wagon. Gunshots exploded above her head as Isaac fired at the rustlers, who quickly took cover behind her burning barn. "You all right?" Isaac called, dismounting and crouching beside a large boulder near the trail. "Yes," she shouted back, heart pounding in her ears. "There are 2 of them." More gunfire erupted, the rustlers returning fire from their position. A bullet splintered wood inches from Willa's head, sending her scrambling for better cover beneath the wagon. "Stay down," Isaac commanded, firing 2 more shots toward the barn. A cry of pain suggested he'd found his mark. One of the rustlers staggered into view, clutching his shoulder. The other Jed used the distraction to make a break for their waiting wagon. "He's getting away," Willa called. Isaac was already moving, racing across the open ground with a speed that surprised her. He tackled Jed just as the rustler reached the wagon, bringing him down hard in the dirt. The two men grappled, rolling dangerously close to the burning barn. Willa crawled out from under her wagon and retrieved her rifle. The wounded rustler was trying to mount one of her milk cows in a desperate attempt to escape. She aimed carefully and fired, the bullet striking the ground by his feet. "Don't move," she ordered, advancing on him with the rifle leveled at his chest. Meanwhile, Isaac had gained the upper hand in his fight with Jed. A solid punch to the jaw left the rustler dazed, and Isaac quickly bound his hands with a length of rope from his saddle bags. Only when both men were secured did Willa fully register the devastation around her. Her barn, the structure her father had built with his own hands, was beyond saving, the roof now partially collapsed as flames consumed the timbers. "The animals," she gasped, looking around frantically. "My cows, the mule, I got them out," Isaac said, coming to stand beside her. His face was smudged with soot, a cut above his eye dripping blood down his cheek. "When I arrived and saw the fire, I released them from the barn before confronting these vermin. They're in the corral behind your cabin." Relief flooded through her. "Thank God you came when you did." Then reality hit her, "But you weren't expected for another week at least." A small smile crossed his dirt-streaked face. "The cattle drive finished early. I couldn't wait to see you again." Before Willa could respond, the sound of horses approaching drew their attention. Sheriff Porter and two deputies rode into the clearing, rifles at the ready. "Miss Matthews," Porter called, taking in the scene with widening eyes. "We saw the smoke from town. What in tarnation happened here?" While Isaac explained the situation to the sheriff, Willa sank down onto a fallen log, the events of the last hour catching up with her. Her barn was gone. If Isaac hadn't arrived when he did, she might be gone too, or worse. After the sheriff and his men departed with the rustlers in tow, promising to return the next day to take formal statements, Willa and Isaac were finally alone. The barn had burned to the ground, leaving only smoldering ruins and the acrid smell of smoke hanging in the air. "You're hurt," Willa said, noticing again the cut above Isaac's eye. "It's nothing," he insisted, though he didn't pull away when she led him to the cabin's porch and insisted he sit while she fetched water and cloth to clean the wound. They were silent as she gently washed away the blood and dirt from his face. His blue eyes never left hers, intense in a way that made her heart flutter despite the day's trauma. "You saved my life," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Isaac caught her hand as she finished tending his cut. "I think we might be even now, those days in your cabin during the blizzard." He paused, seeming to search for words. "Willa, they changed something in me." She sat beside him on the porch step, their shoulders nearly touching. "What do you mean? All these years I've been drifting, never staying in one place too long." His voice was thoughtful, measured. "I told myself I was looking for something, but I didn't know what until I met you." Willa's breath caught in her throat. "And what were you looking for?" Isaac turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "A place that feels like home, a reason to stop wandering." His eyes held hers with unwavering intensity. "I found both in that cabin with you." The world seemed to still around them. Willa was acutely aware of his calloused hands holding hers, of the sincerity in his gaze, of the weight of his words. "Isaac," she began, her voice unsteady, "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything right now," he assured her. "I know this is sudden and after today's events." He glanced toward the smoldering remains of her barn. "But I want you to know that I've never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. These past months, your letters have been the brightest part of my days." Willa felt tears welling in her eyes, not from sadness, but from a complex mixture of emotions she couldn't fully name. "Mine too," she admitted. "I've been counting the days until your return." Isaac's face softened. "I wanted to court you properly. Take you to dinner in town, bring you flowers, do things right." He gave a rueful laugh. "Instead, I show up in the middle of a firefight." Despite everything, Willa found herself smiling. "I'd say that makes a more memorable story than flowers." His answering smile warmed her to her core. Then his expression grew serious again. Willa, I know you value your independence. I respect that more than I can say, but I also want you to know that you don't have to face everything alone anymore, not if you don't want to. The meaning behind his words was clear, though he hadn't explicitly stated it. Willa took a deep breath, gathering her courage. What exactly are you proposing, Isaac Thornton? She asked, her voice steadier than she felt. He released one of her hands to reach into his vest pocket, producing a small object that glinted in the fading light. A ring, simple but beautiful, a small sapphire set in silver. I'm proposing partnership, he said softly. A life built together where neither of us has to gather firewood alone again. Tears spilled freely down Willa's cheeks now. But your brother's ranch, your plans, Will can manage without me, Isaac interrupted gently. Or we could build something new together wherever you want. This homestead, somewhere else entirely, it doesn't matter to me. He pressed the ring into her palm, closing her fingers around it. All that matters is that we're together. Willa looked down at the ring in her hand, then at the devastation where her barn had stood, and finally at the cabin that had been her only home. For months, she'd fought to maintain her father's legacy alone, refusing to admit how desperately lonely and overwhelming it had been. I don't want to leave, she said finally. This land, this home, it's part of me, but I don't want to be alone anymore either. Isaac's face lit with hope. Then we'll rebuild right here, starting with that barn. Willa opened her hand, looking at the ring that represented so much more than a simple piece of jewelry. It was a promise, a future, a hand to hold in both the brightest days and darkest nights. Yes, she whispered, then louder, yes, Isaac, I'll marry you. His smile was brighter than the setting sun as he took the ring and slipped it onto her finger. Then he leaned forward, his hand gently cupping her cheek, and kissed her with such tenderness that Willa felt her heart might burst. When they finally parted, the world around them had transformed. The burned barn, the day's danger, none of it seemed as devastating in the light of what they had found together. We should probably get some rest, Isaac suggested, though he made no move to release her from his embrace. Tomorrow will be a long day. We have a barn to start rebuilding. Willa nodded, her head against his shoulder. We have a lot to rebuild. Together, he added, pressing a kiss to her forehead. Together, she agreed, the word containing all the promise of their future. The following weeks passed in a blur of activity. True to his word, Isaac began rebuilding the barn the very next day. Word of the attack and subsequent engagement spread quickly through the small community of Pinecrest, and to Willa's surprise, neighbors she barely knew arrived to help with the reconstruction. Never realized how many friends your father had, Isaac remarked one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset after a long day of work. The new barn's framework stood nearly complete, a testament to the community's generosity. He always said frontier folks stick together, Willa replied, her head resting comfortably on his shoulder. I just never expected it to extend to me after he was gone. Isaac's arm tightened around her. You've earned their respect, standing your ground against those rustlers. She laughed softly. I think they're more impressed with you, the cavalryman turned cowboy who rode in at the perfect moment to save the day. Perfect timing was pure luck, he admitted, if I'd arrived 10 minutes later. Willa placed her hand over his, feeling the strength and warmth of his fingers. But you didn't. You were exactly where you needed to be. They settled into a comfortable rhythm in the days that followed. Isaac proved himself not just capable but innovative in his approach to improving the homestead. He redesigned the barn to be more efficient, added a proper chicken coop, and even began drafting plans to expand the cabin once they were married. Their wedding was set for June, a simple ceremony to be held on the homestead itself. Willa's new dress, the blue calico that had survived the attack, was nearly finished, and Isaac had ordered a proper suit from Helena, an extravagance he insisted upon despite her protests. A man only gets married once, he told her when the package arrived. At least, that's my intention. May turned to June, and the day before their wedding arrived with perfect weather. The new barn stood complete, the garden was flourishing, and wildflowers bloomed across the meadow where they would exchange their vows. That evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Isaac, still insisting on sleeping in the barn until they were properly wed, a knock at the door surprised them both. Willa opened it to find William Thornton, Isaac's brother, standing on her porch. He was taller than Isaac, but with the same blue eyes, though his carried a sharper, more calculating look. "Will," Isaac exclaimed, coming to the door. "You made it," the brothers embraced, though Willa couldn't help noticing a certain stiffness in William's posture. "Wouldn't miss my little brother's wedding," William replied, his smile not quite reaching his eyes as he turned to Willa. "Miss Matthews, it's a pleasure to finally meet you. Isaac's letters have spoken of little else these past months. Please call me Willa," she said, extending her hand. "And the pleasure is mine. Isaac has told me so much about you and your ranch." William's handshake was firm but brief. "Yes, well, speaking of the ranch," he glanced at Isaac. "Might we have a word in private, brother?" Isaac frowned slightly but nodded. "Of course." He turned to Willa. "We won't be long." As the brothers stepped outside, Willa couldn't quell the uneasiness that settled in her stomach. Something in William's manner suggested he hadn't come merely to celebrate their union. She busied herself preparing coffee, trying not to listen to the murmur of voices that occasionally rose in volume before quieting again. When the door finally opened 15 minutes later, Isaac's expression was troubled. "Everything all right?" Willa asked, setting 3 cups on the table. "Fine," Isaac replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Was just bringing me up to date on some ranch business." William accepted the offered coffee with a tight smile. "Isaac's being modest. I've come with an opportunity, one that could secure both your futures." Willa sat down, her uneasiness growing. "What kind of opportunity?" "I've just purchased the neighboring property," William explained, his tone becoming animated for the first time. "Another 5,000 acres with water rights to the eastern tributary. Combined with our existing land, it would make Thornton Ranch one of the largest operations in the territory." "That's wonderful news," Willa said, glancing at Isaac's still troubled expression. "But what does it have to do with us?" William set down his cup. "I need a partner, someone I can trust to manage the expansion, someone with cavalry experience who knows how to handle men and cattle alike." He looked pointedly at Isaac. "The position comes with a 1/3 share in the entire operation. You'd be a wealthy man within 5 years, Isaac." Understanding dawned on Willa. "You want Isaac to return to Fort Benton with you?" "Not just Isaac," William corrected. "Both of you, of course. There's a fine house on the new property, nothing fancy, but far more substantial than—" He gestured around the cabin. "This." Silence fell heavy across the room. Willa looked at Isaac, whose eyes were fixed on the table before him. "We've already discussed this, Will," Isaac finally said, his voice quiet but firm. "My place is here now." William's expression hardened. "Don't be a fool, brother. This is 5,000 acres of prime Montana ranchland against what 50 acres of forest and rocks. This is the opportunity we've talked about for years." "That you've talked about," Isaac corrected. "I never wanted an empire, Will, just a place to call home. And you think you'll find that here?" William's voice rose slightly. "Playing farmer on a widow's homestead?" Isaac's jaw tightened. "Willa isn't a widow, and this isn't just any homestead. It's ours." The brothers stared at each other across the table, years of unspoken tensions vibrating between them. Willa felt caught in the middle of a battle whose origins predated her involvement in Isaac's life. "Perhaps I should give you two some privacy," she suggested, starting to rise. "No," Isaac said firmly, reaching for her hand. "This concerns you too, Willa. You should hear everything." He turned back to his brother. "Will, I appreciate the offer, I truly do, but my decision is made. I'm staying here, building a life with Willa." William shook his head, disappointment evident in every line of his face. "You always were too romantic for your own good, Isaac. Love doesn't feed a family or build a future. Neither does ambition alone," Isaac countered. "I've seen what your drive for expansion has cost you, Will. 2 failed marriages, children who barely know you, that's enough." William cut him off sharply. He stood, placing his hat back on his head. "I can see I've wasted my time coming here. The offer stands until after the wedding. Think on it, brother." Without another word, he strode to the door and left, the sound of his horses' hooves fading into the night. Willa and Isaac sat in silence for several long moments after his departure. Finally, she spoke the words that had been forming in her mind throughout the exchange. "You should consider his offer, Isaac." He looked up, surprise evident in his expression. "What?" Willa squeezed his hand. 5,000 acres, water rights, a partnership in one of the territory's largest ranches. That's not something to dismiss lightly. "Willa, let me finish," she said gently. "I love you for choosing this life with me. But I need to know that 5 years from now, you won't regret turning down such an opportunity." Isaac moved to kneel beside her chair, taking both her hands in his. "Willa Matthews, I have spent my entire adult life searching for something I couldn't name. I've seen more of this country than most men ever will, worked more jobs than I can count, and never once felt the sense of peace I found sitting at this very table during a blizzard." His eyes held hers with unwavering certainty. "I don't want William's empire. I want this homestead, this life with you." Tears welled in Willa's eyes. "But what about children, our future? William's right that 50 acres isn't much compared to what he's offering." "It's enough," Isaac assured her. "More than enough. We'll expand when we need to, work the land the way your father taught you. And yes, we'll have children who'll grow up knowing both their parents, not just seeing their father when he rides in from the range every few weeks." The conviction in his voice banished the last of her doubts. Willa leaned forward, resting her forehead against his. "I just wanted to be sure." "I've never been more sure of anything," he murmured, brushing his lips against hers. "Now, I should probably go find my brother before he rides all the way back to Fort Benton in a huff." Willa smiled. "Family is complicated." "Indeed," Isaac agreed, rising to his feet. "But worth fighting for just the same. I won't be long." After he left, Willa moved to the porch, gazing up at the stars that blanketed the Montana sky. Tomorrow she would become Mrs. Isaac Thornton. The thought filled her with a joy so complete it bordered on disbelief. She thought about the day Isaac had found her gathering firewood in the forest, how his simple offer of assistance had changed the course of her life. "You don't have to anymore," he'd said, words that had come to mean so much more than sharing the burden of physical labor. The sound of horses approaching drew her attention. Isaac and William were returning together, their voices carrying in the still night air. Though she couldn't make out their words, the tone suggested reconciliation rather than continued conflict. They dismounted near the barn, embracing briefly before William departed again, this time with a wave toward the cabin where Willa stood watching. "Everything all right?" she asked when Isaac joined her on the porch. He nodded, slipping an arm around her waist. "Well, still disappointed, but he understands, or at least he's trying to." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "He's giving us a herd of 30 cattle as a wedding present, says every proper ranch needs a starting stock." Willa laughed softly. "That's quite a peace offering." "Will has his own way of showing he cares," Isaac explained. "He's not good with words, but he's always been generous in his own fashion." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the moon rise over the distant mountains. Tomorrow would bring their wedding day, the beginning of their life together, but tonight already felt like the fulfillment of a promise made months ago in a snowy forest. "It's getting late," Isaac finally said. "I should let you rest before the big day." Willa turned in his arms, looking up at the man who had ridden into her life and changed everything. "I love you, Isaac Thornton." His smile was tender as he brushed a strand of hair from her face. "And I love you, Willa Matthews, soon-to-be Thornton." One more kiss, and he was gone, walking toward the barn where he would spend his last night as a bachelor. Willa watched him go, her heart full to bursting with gratitude for the twist of fate that had brought them together. The morning of their wedding dawned clear and warm, a perfect June day in the Montana Territory. Willa stood at her bedroom window, watching the early light paint the meadow in gold. In a few hours, she would walk across that meadow to meet Isaac beneath the old oak tree where they would exchange their vows. Martha Wilson arrived shortly after breakfast, along with the pastor's wife and 2 other women from Pinecrest, all eager to help the bride prepare. They brought flowers for her hair, borrowed lace for her dress, and endless advice about married life that made Willa blush to the roots of her hair. "Your mother would be so proud," Martha said as she fastened the last button on Willa's blue calico dress. "And your father, too." She stepped back, eyes glistening. "You make a beautiful bride, my dear." Willa gazed at her reflection in the small mirror above her washstand. The woman who looked back at her seemed transformed not just by the dress or the flowers woven into her upswept hair, but by the happiness that radiated from within. Outside, she could hear the sounds of guests arriving, horses and wagons, voices calling greetings, children laughing as they played near the corral. It seemed half of Pinecrest had turned out for the occasion, along with neighboring homesteaders and even a few of Isaac's former cavalry companions who had made the journey to witness their friend's marriage. A knock at the door announced the arrival of Sheriff Porter, looking unusually formal in a clean black coat. "Miss Matthews," he said, removing his hat. "I know your father can't be here to walk you down the aisle, but as an old friend of his, I'd be honored to escort you if you'd allow it." Tears threatened to ruin the careful work Martha had done with her hair. "Thank you, Sheriff. I'd like that very much." At noon, Willa stepped out of the cabin on the sheriff's arm. The gathered crowd turned to watch her approach, but she had eyes only for Isaac, waiting beneath the oak tree beside the pastor. He looked so handsome in his new suit, his dark hair combed neatly, his face clean-shaven for the occasion. The moment their eyes met across the meadow, everything else faded away: the guests, the music from a borrowed fiddle, even the nervousness that had fluttered in her stomach all morning. There was only Isaac and the future they would build together. Their vows were simple but heartfelt. Isaac's voice remained steady as he promised to love, honor, and cherish her all the days of his life. Willa's trembled slightly as she made the same pledge, overwhelmed by the journey that had brought them to this moment. "By the power vested in me," the pastor concluded, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." Isaac's kiss was gentle but full of promise, sealing their union before their community of friends and neighbors, when they turned to face the gathered crowd as Mr. and Mrs. Thornton. The cheer that went up seemed to echo across the mountains. The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening. Tables were set up near the new barn, laden with food contributed by every guest. There was dancing to fiddle music, storytelling around the bonfire, and more than a few toasts to the happy couple. William Thornton, who had indeed stayed for the wedding, stood to offer a particularly moving tribute to his brother and new sister-in-law. "I've watched Isaac search for his place in this world for as long as I can remember," he said, raising his glass. "Today, I finally see that he's found it not in acres or cattle, but in the heart of a woman brave enough to match his spirit. To Isaac and Willa, may your lives together be as beautiful as this day." As twilight deepened into night, the guests gradually departed, leaving the newlyweds alone at last. They stood on the porch of their cabin, now truly theirs together, watching the last wagon disappear down the trail. "Well, Mrs. Thornton," Isaac said, his arm around her waist, "how does it feel to be a married woman?" Willa leaned into his embrace. "Wonderful, perfect." She looked up at him with a mischievous smile, "though I must say it will be nice to have you sleeping in the cabin instead of the barn." Isaac laughed, the sound rich with happiness. "I couldn't agree more." With one fluid movement, he swept her into his arms. "I believe it's tradition for the groom to carry his bride across the threshold." "Far be it from me to argue with tradition," Willa replied, wrapping her arms around his neck. As Isaac carried her into their home, into the beginning of their life together, Willa thought again of that day in the forest, how a chance encounter had led to this moment of perfect joy. "You don't have to anymore," he had told her then, offering to carry her firewood. Now those words held the promise of a lifetime of burdens shared, of sorrows halved and joys doubled, of a love that would warm them through all the seasons to come. The years that followed brought both challenges and blessings to the Thornton homestead. The first winter of their marriage tested their resources, but strengthened their partnership as they worked side by side to care for their growing herd and prepare for the future. Spring arrived with news that brought tears of joy to Willa's eyes and a whoop of delight from Isaac. Their family would be expanding by Christmas. Through summer's heat and autumn's harvest, Willa's body changed, nurturing the new life growing within. On a snowy December night in 1879, with Martha Wilson serving as midwife and Isaac pacing anxiously outside the bedroom door, Willa gave birth to a healthy son. They named him James Matthew Thornton, honoring both her father and Isaac's cavalry captain, who had become like a father to him during the war. Little James proved to be the first of 3 children who would fill their home with laughter and occasional chaos over the next 6 years. Emma Rose arrived 2 years after her brother, with her father's blue eyes and her mother's quiet determination. And finally, Daniel William, named in part as a peace offering to Uncle Will, who had by then fully reconciled with Isaac and visited the homestead at least twice yearly. The 50 acres that William had once dismissed grew to 100, then 200 as the Thorntons gradually purchased neighboring parcels when homesteaders moved on to other territories. Their cattle herd expanded accordingly, providing a comfortable living without the empire building that had driven William's ambitions. In 1883, Pinecrest built its promised schoolhouse, and Willa realized another dream by teaching there 3 days a week while Isaac managed the ranch. Her classroom filled with the children of miners, ranchers, and shopkeepers, a new generation growing up in a territory that was gradually leaving behind its wildest days. There were difficult times, of course. The winter of 1886 brought blizzards that decimated cattle herds throughout Montana, including a third of the Thorntons' stock. A drought 2 years later threatened their crops and pastureland until late summer rains finally broke the dry spell. Through it all, Isaac and Willa faced each challenge together, their bond deepening with each passing season. The passion that had flared between them from the beginning mellowed, but never dimmed, transforming into a love that sustained them through hardship and celebrated with them in times of plenty. On a warm June evening in 1888, exactly 10 years after their wedding day, Isaac and Willa sat on the porch of their expanded cabin, now a proper ranch house with rooms for each of their children, and even a small library where Willa prepared her lessons, and Isaac kept the ranch accounts. Their children played in the meadow, a game involving much running and laughter whose rules only they understood. The setting sun painted the mountains gold and purple, a view that still took Willa's breath away even after all these years. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, her head resting on Isaac's shoulder as they watched their children. "Regret what?" he asked, his arm tightening around her. "Choosing this life instead of joining William's operation." Isaac chuckled. "Not for a single moment." He turned to look at her, his face lined now with a decade of Montana weather and parenthood, but his blue eyes still bright with the same light she'd first seen in the forest. "Will visits twice a year and spends most of his time complaining about his business partners. Meanwhile, I wake up every morning beside the woman I love, watch our children grow, and work land that means something to us." Willa smiled, lifting her face for his kiss. "I just wanted to be sure. Always the teacher checking my answers," he teased. Then more seriously, "What about you? Do you ever wish we'd settled closer to town? Somewhere with more conveniences, perhaps?" She shook her head. "Never. This land is part of us now, our history and our future." She looked toward the oak tree where they'd exchanged their vows, now supplemented by a small family cemetery where her parents rested. Someday, many years hence, she and Isaac would join them there, their journey complete. "Mama, Papa, look what I found." 6-year-old Emma ran toward them, clutching something in her small hands. Her brothers followed close behind, equally excited by whatever discovery she'd made. As they gathered their children onto the porch to examine Emma's treasure, a bird's nest fallen from a tree, perfect and intact, Willa caught Isaac's gaze over their daughter's head. The love and contentment she saw reflected there matched her own heart perfectly. From a chance meeting in a snowy forest to this moment of simple family joy, their path had never been easy, but it had always been right. Together, They had built something far more precious than William's empire of land and cattle, a home where love grew as naturally as the wildflowers in their meadow, renewing itself with each passing season. And neither of them ever had to gather firewood alone again.